The Burning of the SANDS by Rudyard Kipling. Men have sailed the seas for so many years, and have there done such amazing things in the face of danger, difficulty, and death, that no one tale of heroism exists which cannot be equalled by at least scores of others. But since the behavior of bodies of untried men under trying circumstances is always interesting, and since I have been put in possession of some facts not very generally known, I am trying to tell again the old story of the SANDS, as an example of long-drawn-out and undefeatable courage and cool-headedness. She was a small four-masted iron-built screw steamer of 1,100 tons chartered to take out troops to India. That was in 1857, the year of the Indian Mutiny, when anything that could sail or steer was in great demand, for troops were being thrown into the country as fast as circumstances allowed, which was not very fast. Among the regiments sent out was the 54th of the line, now the 2nd Battalion of the Dorset Regimenter Good Corps, about 100 years old, with a very fair record of service, but in no special way differing so far as one could see from many other regiments. It was dispatched in 3 ships, the headquarters, that is to say the lieutenant colonel, the regimental books, pachist band and colours, which last represent the very soul of a battalion, and some 14 officers, 354 rank and file, and perhaps a dozen women left Portsmouth on the 15th of August, all packed tight in the SANDS. Her crew, with the exception of the engineers and firemen, seemed to have been foreigners and pierhead jumpers picked up at the last minute. They turned out bad, lazy and insubordinate. The accommodation for the troops was generously described as inferior, and what men called inferior in 1857 would now be called unspeakable, nor, in spite of the urgent need, was there any great hurry about the SANDS. She took 2 long months to reach Cape Town, and she stayed there 5 days to coal, leaving on the 20th of October. By this time, the crew were all but openly mutinous, and the troops, who must have picked up a little seamanship, had to work the ship out of harbour. On the 7th of November, nearly 3 weeks later, a squall struck her and carried away her foremast, and it is to be presumed that the troops turned to and cleared away the wreckage on the 11th of November. The real trouble began, for in the afternoon of that day, 90 days out from Portsmouth, a party of soldiers working in the hold saw smoke coming up from the afterhatch. They were then maybe within 1,000 miles of the island of Mauritius, in half a gale and a sea full of sharks. Captain Castles, the master, promptly lowered and provisioned the boats, got them overside with some difficulty, and put the women into them. Some of the sailors, the engineers, the firemen, and a few others behaved well, jumped into the longboat, lowered it, and kept well away from the ship. They knew she carried 2 magazines full of cartridges, and were taking no chances. The troops, on the other hand, did not make any fuss, but under their officers' orders cleared out the starboard or right-hand magazine, while volunteers tried to save the regimental colours. These stood at the end of the saloon, probably clamped against the partition behind the captain's chair, and the saloon was full of smoke. 2 lieutenants made a dash thither, but were nearly suffocated. A ship's quartermaster, Richmond was his name, put a wet cloth over his face, managed to tear down the colours, and then fainted. A privateer, his name was Whilst dragged out both Richmond and the colours, and the 2 men dropped senseless on the deck, while the troops cheered. That at least was a good beginning, for, as I have said, the colours are the soul of every body of men who fight or work under them. The saloon must have been one of the narrow, cabin-lined, old-fashioned cuddies placed above the screw, and all the fire was in the stern of the ship behind the engineer-room. It was blazing very close to the port or left-hand magazine, and as an explosion there would have the SANDS out like a squib. They called for more volunteers, and one of the lieutenants who had been choked in the saloon recovered, went down first, and passed up a barrel of ammunition, which was at once hove overboard. After this example, work went on with regularity. When the men taking out the ammunition fainted, as they did fairly often, they pulled them up with ropes. Those who did not faint grabbed what explosives they could feel or handle in the smother, and brought them up, and an official and serene quartermaster sergeant stood on the hatch, and jotted down the number of barrels so retrieved in his notebook. As they were thrown into the sea, they pulled out all except 2 barrels which slid from the arms of a fainting man. There was a fair amount of fainting that evening and rolled out of reach. Besides these, there were another couple of barrels of signalling powder for the ship's use. But this the troops did not know, and were the more comfortable for their ignorance. Then the flames broke through the afterdeck, the light attracting shoals of sharks, and the mizzenmast, farthest aft of all the masts, flared up, and went overside with a crash. This would have veered the stern of the ship to the wind, in which case the flames must have swept forward. But a man with a hatchet, his name is Lastran, along the bulwarks, and cut the wreck clear while the boat full of women surged and rocked at a safe distance, and the sharks tried to upset it with their tails. A captain of the 54 THHE was a jovial soul, and made jokes throughout the struggle, headed a party of men to cut away the bridge, the deck cabins, and everything else that was inflammable in case of the flames sweeping forward. Aginwhile, a provident lieutenant, with some more troops, lashed spars and things together for a raft, and other gangs pumped water desperately on to what was left of the saloon and the magazines. One record says quaintly it was necessary to make some deviation from the usual military evolutions. While the flames were in progress, the men formed in sections, countermarched round the forward part of the ship, which may perhaps be better understood when it is stated that those with their faces to the after part, where the fire raged, were on their way to relieve their comrades who had been working below. Those proceeding forward were going to recruit their exhausted strength and prepare for another attack when it came to their turn. No one seemed to have much hopes of saving the ship so long as the last of the powder was unaccounted for. Indeed, Captain Castles told an officer of the 54th that the game was up, and the officer replied, "Well, fight till we're driven overboard." It seemed he would be taken at his word, for just then the signalling powder and the ammunition casks went up, and the ship, seen from midships aft, looked like one floating volcano. The cartridges spluttered like crackers, and cabin doors and timbers were shot up all over the deck, and 2 or 3 men were hurt. But thighs is not in any official record. Just after the roar of it, when her stern was dipping deadlily, and all believed the Sarah SANDS was settling for her last lurch, some merry jester of the 54th cried, "Lights out," and the jovial captain shouted back, "All right, well, keep the old woman afloat." Yet not one man of the troops made any attempt to get onto the rafts, and when they found the ship was still floating, they all went back to work double tides. At this point in the story, we come across Mr. Fraser, the Scotch engineer, who, like most of his countrymen, had been holding his trump card in reserve. He knew the Sarah SANDS was built with a watertight bulkhead behind the engineer room and the coal bunkers, and he proposed to cut through the bulkhead and pump on the fire. Also, he pointed out that it would be well to remove the coal in the bunkers, as the bulkhead behind was almost red-hot, and the coal was catching light. So volunteers dropped into the bunkers, each man for the minute or 2 he could endure it, and shoveled away the singeing, fuming fuel, and other volunteers were lowered into the bonfire aft, and when they could throw no more water on it, they were pulled up half-roasted. Mr. Fraser's plan saved the ship, though every particle of wood in the after part of her was destroyed, and a bluish vapour hung over the red-hot iron beams and ties, and the sea for miles about looked like blood under the glare as they pumped and passed water in buckets, flooding the stern, sluicing the engineer room bulkhead, and damping the coal beyond it all through the long night. The very sides of the ship were red-hot, so that they wondered when her plates would buckle and wrench out the rivets, and let the whole affair down to the sharks. The foremast had carried away on the squall of the 7th of November, the mizzenmast, as you know, had gone in the fire. The mainmast, though wrapped round with wet blankets, was alight, and everything abaft the mainmast was one red furnace. There was the constant danger of the ship, now broadside on to the heavy seas, falling off before the heavy wind, and leading the flames forward again, so they hailed the boats to tow and hold her head to wind, but only the gig obeyed the order. The others had all they could do to keep afloat. One of them had been swamped, though all her people were saved, and as for the longboat full of mutinous seamen, she behaved infamously. One record says that she not only held aloof, but consigned the ship and all she carried to perdition, so the Sarah SANDS fought for her own life alone with the sharks in attendance. About 3 on the morning of the 12th of November, pumping, bucketing, sluicing, and damping, they began to hope that they had bested the fire. By 9 o'clock they saw steam coming up from her insides, instead of smoke, and at midday they called in the boats and took stock of the damage. From the mizzenmast aft there was nothing that you could call ship, except just the mere shell of her. It was all one steaming heap of scrap iron, with 20 feet of black greasy water flooding across the bent and twisted rods, and in the middle of it, all 4 huge water tanks rolled to and fro, thundering against the naked sides. Moreover, they could not see till things had cooled down. The powder explosions had blown a hole right through her port quarter, and every time she rolled the sea came in there green. Of the 4 masts, only one was left, and the rudderhead stuck up all bold, black and horrible among the jam of collapsed deck beams. A photograph of the wreck looks exactly like that of a gutted theatre after the flames, and the firemen have done their worst. They spent the whole of the 12th of November pumping water out as zealously as they had pumped it in. They lashed up the loose charging tanks. As soon as they were cool enough to touch, they plugged the hole at the stern with hammocks, sails and planks, and a sail over all. Then they rigged up a horizontal bar. Gripping the rudderhead, 6 men sat on planks on one side and 6 at the other over the empty pit, beneath, hauling on to the bar with ropes and letting go as they were told, that made the best steering gear that they could devise. On the 13th of November, still pumping, they spread one sail on their solitary mast. It was lucky that the SANDS had started with 4 of them and took advantage of the trade winds to make for Mauritius. Captain Castles, with 1 chart and 1 compass, lived in a tent where some cabins had once been, and at the end of 12 more days, he sighted land. Their average run was about 4 knots an hour, and it is no wonder that as soon as they were off Port Louis, Mauritius, Mr. Fraser, the Scotch engineer, wished to start his engines and enter port professionally. The troops looked down into the black hollow of the ship when the shaft made its first revolution, shaking the hull horribly. And if you can realize what it means to be able to see a naked screwshaft at work from the upper deck of a liner, you can realize what had happened to the SANDS. They waited outside Port Louis for the daylight and were nearly dashed to pieces on a coral reef. Then the gutted, empty steamer came in, very dirty, the men's clothes so charred that they hardly dared to take them off, and very hungry, but without having lost one single life. Port Louis gave them all a public banquet in the marketplace, and the French inhabitants were fascinatingly polite, as only the French can be. But the records say nothing of what befell the sailors who consigned the ship to perdition. One account merely hints that this was no time for retribution, but the troops probably administered their own justice during the 12 days' limp to port. The men who were berthed aft, the officers, and the women lost everything they had, and the companies berthed forward lent them clothes and canvas to make some sort of raiment. On the 20th of December, they were all re-embarked on the Clarendon. It was poor accommodation for heroes. She had been condemned, as a coolie ship was full of centipedes and other animals picked up in the Brazil trade. Her engines broke down frequently, and her captain died of exposure and anxiety during a hurricane, so it was the 25th of January before she reached the mouth of the Hugli. By this time many of the men probably considered this quite as serious, as the Fire troops were out of tobacco, and when they came across the American ship Hamlet, Captain Leckran, lying at Kedgeree, on the way up the river to Calcutta, the officers rowed over to ask if there was any tobacco for sale. They told the skipper the history of their adventures, and he said, "Well, I am glad you've come to me, because I have some tobacco." "How many are you?" "300 men," said the officers. Thereupon Captain Leckran got out 400 pounds of best Cavendish, as well as 1,000 Manila cigars for the officers, and refused to take payment on the grounds that Americans did not accept anything from shipwrecked people. They were not shipwrecked at the time, but evidently they had been shipwrecked quite enough for Captain Leckran, because when they rowed back second time and insisted on paying, he only gave them grog, which, says the record, caused it to be dark when we returned to our ship. After this, our band played Yankee Doodle, blue lights were burned, the signal gun fired. That must have been a lively evening at Kedgeree, and everything in our power was had recourse to so as to convey to our American cousins our appreciation of their kindness. Last of all, the Commander-in-Chief issued a general order to be read at the head of every regiment in the army. He was pleased to observe that the behavior of the 54th Regiment was most praiseworthy, and by its result must render manifest to all the advantage of subordination and strict obedience to orders under the most alarming and dangerous circumstances in which soldiers can be placed. This seems to be the moral of the tale,